Thank you for taking the time to listen in to us today and listen to our message of what we are doing and where we're actually going. My name is Hans O'Sullivan. I'm the CEO and one of the founders of StorMagic, founded back in 2006 now, so we're going about 8 years. What I'll go through in this first presentation is on the screen here. So the first section of this is basically a bit of history on why we're here in the first place. How do we actually get here? And what's the background of the company? So as I said, I'm one of the founders of the company. The other founder of the company is Chris Ferry, our CTO, who probably even listening online at the moment back in the UK. We've been actually working together quite a long time in the industry. So where StorMagic is 8 years old, the team has actually been around a lot longer than that. We actually started together in a company called Eurologic, which I founded back in 1989. Eurologic were pioneers in RAID storage and fibre channel storage. We're very early on in the whole principle of SANs. After Eurologic, we actually founded another company called Ellipsan, and Ellipsan were pioneers in iSCSI. Basically, at that point, what we wanted to do was take the technologies we developed, fibre channel SANs, and to commoditize it. See if we could actually do it over Ethernet, see if we could do it on standard x86 hardware, and bring the cost and the availability down for general use. At the time, a lot of people said, "You're crazy, how the hell can you do storage protocols over IP?" But now it's everywhere, and now everybody actually uses it. Both companies we exited well and sold on. After a couple of years non-compete, we got back together again in 2006 to found StorMagic. And with StorMagic, what we wanted to do was to simplify storage. It had been, at this stage, it started to be commoditized, but now we felt it needed to be a hell of a lot simpler. There was too many buzzwords. It was too difficult to use. You needed expensive trained personnel to actually manage what you were doing, and there was no need for any of that. So we wanted to develop a strong management suite for storage, particularly tied to the Windows platform at the time, that allowed you to easily implement and utilize storage. We moved on from that, and I'll be quite honest, where we released a very, very good product, we found it difficult to sell, because how do you get the message out there that this product is easy and simple to use? Everybody says that. It's not real, but it was difficult for us to get out there. So we actually moved into the virtual environment instead. We realized that our technology had a very, very good fit on top of what was just then called ESX, where we could actually virtualize the internal storage of the disk drives and turn it into a virtual SAN. And that the big gap that was needed at that stage was the management being able to do that. So we released that product in 2009. And then moved on in 2011 to actually focus on large enterprises with multiple remote locations. We actually use the word the distributed enterprise rather than referring to robo. Why? Well, if you actually look at the type of customers that use our technology, it doesn't necessarily fit in what you think of as robo. When you think of robo, you think remote office, branch office. It's a bank, it's an insurance company. But if you look at our customers, we have people like Eon Energy use us for wind farm management. You don't think of that as a remote office. German Army uses us for battlefield communication systems. In fact, I'll be talking a bit more about these later on in some customer case studies. So these are people that need to have remote IT for one reason or another, and need to be able to manage that centrally, and need to be able to have that highly available. They are the characteristics of the typical customer that uses our technology. And over the last couple of years, we've seen significant growth as our technology is being more and more accepted. And I'll give you some of the figures later on how we're doing in the market as well. So our target market. If everybody's well aware that people are attempting to centralize more and more. I use the word centralize because that could be cloud, or that could be back into their own data center, or it could be private cloud, but they're trying to centralize as much as possible. And cloud obviously is a very, very important strategy. But it's part of the strategy. It's not the entire strategy. There's an awful lot of applications out there that don't necessarily fit well into the cloud for various reasons. It could be for performance reasons, that the actual link to your remote locations, the amount of data you need to get out there, is not sufficient, or it's not reliable enough, or the latency is wrong. It could be for availability reasons, that if whatever that remote location is doing stops doing what it's doing, or cannot communicate with the center, then you have a major failure within your business. And if you keep in mind that generally speaking, the edge of the enterprise what we call the edge of the enterprise, those remote locations, that's where you meet your customer. That's where your business meets the customer. If that fails, you've got an unhappy customer. And customers, they're not like employees. Employees have rights. Customers, they can decide they don't want to do business with you because one little thing went wrong. So you've not just lost that business that day, they're probably not going to come back because they'll go next door to your competitor. So it is very, very important that you can service your customer, whatever your business is. And that customer could be outside the business or inside the business. But each business needs to decide for itself what is the SLA with its customer. What availability does it need at the edge to make sure it can keep its customer satisfied and running? Or it could be compliancy reasons that you need to actually keep certain things on the edge. One of the key examples that are actually happening there at the moment is if you're storing your data in the cloud, where's that data? Under what laws does it come? What countries are kept in? Can they change the laws and get access to your data? There's more and more compliancy laws coming in on you need to know where your data is and under what laws it's actually being kept. So if we look at the remote site, the distributed enterprise, what they have at the edge, what is it typically like? What are their requirements? Well, a lot of them are now actually moving to virtualization. So that is, for the last couple of years at the edge, there's been quite a wave of moving to virtualization. Actually, if I jump down here, it probably makes it easier to understand on what is the typical customer we see there. And go back to what I said earlier about defining the distributed enterprise. It's not that, to us, it's not the typical remote office with a few thousand people. They need quite a large IT infrastructure. It could be a retail store. It could be one of those wind farms. Typically what we see is they have about 2 to 4 terabytes of storage maximum. They typically have 7 or 8 key applications. Traditionally those applications would have run on individual servers, but they are moving to virtualization to improve manageability of those applications. They typically have limited network connectivity. A lot of them still running on 1 gig. Some of them want to actually separate their servers on site, so if their fire alarms and sprinklers go off on one side of the building, they want their IT to continue running. They rarely have a computer room environment. You'd be amazed what we actually see out there. We've seen servers nailed to the wall. They're under the desk of the manager. They're in a broom closet with a chair held up against the broom closet so that some air can get in and out. They are not computer rooms. There is no air conditioning or cooling. They are dusty or greasy environments. And you need to have a system that can actually run in those environments. And very often, they are what we call set and forget mentality. They don't want to make changes. It's not a typical office. It's not that they're going to add a new application every day or modify an application every day. It's there to do a job. Very often, they don't even want a console on site that could allow someone to actually make changes to the system. They want to be able to do that only remotely under centralized management. So if you think of that as being the typical description of the type of sites that we actually deal with, then it explains what a lot of things are happening. As I say, a lot of them have moved or are only still moving to virtualization. If they move to virtualization, and if they move everything onto a single server and that single server fails, they've lost 7 or 8 applications. So quite sensibly, they put 2 servers in, and then they have high availability. But as you all know, the problem there is you must have shared storage. Typically for shared storage previously, they would have installed a SAN. So a customer with 2 terabytes of storage, probably what Luke has on his laptop here, is going out and buying a SAN. It doesn't make sense. They need to have shared storage and they need a way of being able to do it. They seldom have any local IT personnel. They want to be able to do this remotely. And those applications where they're key to them, they still want to reduce the cost as much as possible of running those applications and centralizing as much as possible of the management of those applications. Important to them, high availability. If the system goes down, they have a dissatisfied customer, they have a dissatisfied workforce, they could be losing production, they need high availability. They want that centralized management, so they've got 1 or 2 guys sitting in a room monitoring 1,000 sites. If something goes wrong, they need to be told about it, and they need to be able to handle that remotely. As small an IT footprint as possible. If you're sticking it under the desk or the broom closet, you don't want large systems in there. And simple and automated deployment. Our largest customer, which I'll give you more detail on later, has 2,200 locations. Those 2,200 locations are all managed from one central room. They can see all of those locations. They installed all 2,200 at a rate of 30 a night. In fact, they did all the sites are here in North America. They did the installation from India. So you need to be able to easily manage, install, and roll out upgrades to the system from a central location to keep your costs down. I mentioned that you need shared storage, and traditional SAN just does not fit in this environment. There's the first obvious thing: what are you doing with half the capacity of a disk drive, putting a SAN in? But the other thing is, it adds significant cost. It adds power requirements, it adds cooling requirements, it adds sparing requirements. So if you've got 2,000 locations, you're going to have to spare close to those locations for those SAN devices. It adds cost. It also requires separate management capability, which is adding cost. So it is far overkill from what the customer needs in applications like this. And of course, significant increase in CapEx and OpEx. So instead, you use virtual storage. And virtual storage, when we started selling VSAs going back about 5 years ago now, we had to evangelize. People said, great idea, but is this going to work? No, storage needs to be external. Storage needs to be a SAN. Storage needs to be shared, or maybe a NAS. And people didn't believe us. We spend most of our time evangelizing. But the industry's totally changed now. The whole principle of software-defined storage, whatever buzzwords you want to use, is now fairly well widespread. VMware themselves have obviously, over the last few years, brought out their own technology in this space. Initially, their VSA, which could have been a better product, to be diplomatic, with their initial technology release in there. In fact, when they released their VSA, our business took off, because people actually said, oh, this is a great concept, couldn't it be done better? And they went looking for alternatives, and that's when our business started to increase very significantly. Now, they have released a newer technology. It's not a virtual storage appliance, but it's fitting into that market. Their vSAN product. This is a nice product, but this is a product that's aimed at the smaller data center. It's extremely scalable. It scales up extremely well, but it doesn't scale down. And that's where the problem comes in for our target market. So what is our solution? And I'm just going to give you a brief outline of it, because later on I'm going to hand over to Luke, and Luke is going to give you far more detail about the technology and the product, and he's going to run you through a demonstration as well. So what we've attempted to do in the product we have, first of all, eliminate application downtime. And there's actually an important word here: planned and unplanned. So you think of high availability and you actually think, great, yeah, if something goes down, I want this to continue running. But unplanned can be just as important. For instance, that customer, that large customer, if he had to do maintenance on a system, he used to have to send people in after midnight, an engineer in after midnight to go to the system to do maintenance on it. That meant that that location had to be opened, security guards had to see him in. This was an expensive thing to do. If you've got a true highly available system with no single point of failure, then you can actually take down one side of the system, do your maintenance, everything continues running, and then change over to the other side of the system. You can do that in normal business hours, significantly reducing your operational costs. You want future-proof. You want to be able to move to different hypervisors. You want freedom to choose whatever hardware vendor that you're actually using. And that might be not just changing hardware vendor, but if you're doing a refresh on 1,000 sites, in 2 years' time, the probability of the hardware you've chosen still being available is probably fairly low. So being able to move to the next platform, even from the same vendor, can be very, very important. And being able to do that seamlessly is very important. And that's part of the technology that we actually provide, that you can very, very easily move over to totally new hardware. You want that central deployment and management, and you want to save money. And we can actually show in some of the examples that our typical customer actually gets a return on his investment in 6 months. It becomes a no-brainer. Our technology, very, very simple. You have 2 servers. On those servers, you install our software, SVSAN. That software is a virtual storage appliance. It takes ownership of the storage within the server, and it synchronously mirrors to the other server. What the hypervisor thinks it has is an external SAN, identical to an external SAN. It thinks it has 2 data paths, where it actually has 2 copies. If one side fails, it thinks it loses a data path. The applications fail over, and it thinks it's lost a data path. There could be multiple paths, by the way. It's at least 2, because there's 2 copies, but you may have multiple links between the 2 servers as well. Fairly simple to use, very simple to install, does the job. It's an active-active solution, so you can read from both sides of the mirror at the same time.
I'm sorry, you can fit that into like a 12-view enclosure, or?
Well, it's software. So from the hardware point of view, we don't care what it is. So we just fit on top of the hypervisor and take ownership of the storage underneath. That storage could be in the server, that storage could be connected to the server, or that storage could even be out on the network if you want. We don't really care where the storage actually comes from. So the footprint to us is irrelevant. So being an active-active solution allows people, one, to get higher performance, because you can read from both sides of the mirror at the same time, but also allows better performance for less CPU, less resource requirements. Because in these type of applications, if you've got 1,000 sites, if we can help the customer to reduce the actual cost of the servers he's using, over 1,000 sites, that adds up.
So quick question, you said 2, can you do more, or?
Yes, we can. So this totally scales, right? You can scale to as many as you want. The limitations are not ours. The limitations are going to be the cluster limitations of the hypervisor that you're actually using. But within our software, there are no limitations. We highlight 2 because that's actually very, very important. Because we're the only people that can do 2. And I know that's just started off a Twitter storm out there because it does every time. Yes, we are the only people that can do 2-server high availability. Everybody else requires a witness device. That witness device could be another server, and typically is. Or that witness device could be on another server running within there, but you need that third witness server to solve what's called a split brain problem.
Are you doing that? Please.
So are you doing this pass-through, or are you actually doing VMDKs on top of the data store that's created on the
You can do either.
So you can do either way?
Yes.
So I can do straight just disk?
Yes.
Just JBOD disk straight into the appliance itself?
And Luke will go into a lot more detail on that later on.
So where is your witness device then? Because you must have one.
Yes, so what we actually have is a heartbeat device. So we have that in the central console. So the central console, if we look at that customer 2,000 locations, in that central console, he actually has what we call the NSH there.
So that would sit in your data.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that's the first level that we actually do. So that's actually sitting in the center, and it's acting as an arbitrator between the 2 devices to solve split brain. But then besides that, we've built in on site a lot more capability that actually can handle any situations that actually occur. So typically, there would be a minimum of 3 data paths between the 2 servers. You'd have one for mirroring, you'd have one for data, and you'd have one for management. And they typically would be dedicated to those to provide performance. If your mirroring one fails, obviously you're in trouble. That's why you lose your HA. But straight away, we'll start to use any other paths that we can to ensure that you never run into a split brain type situation. So it's a mixture of a centralized witness, which keeps the cost extremely low, and then very good techniques on site to actually limit that actually ever happening.
So you're running a virtual management witness cluster manager?
It is basically a very, very simple, it's best described as a heartbeat device. Right. So just every so often we just say, you alive? Yeah, I'm alive. You alive? Yeah, I'm alive. And it'll say, well, you keep going and you keep going. Keep it extremely simple.
To like a left. Here we go.
If the WAN link goes down and there's no witness,
you'd still have majority. So you need 2 out of 3.
okay.
So are you using a quorum disk anywhere in here, or?
No.
So in Hyper-V, you would require a quorum disk in even numbers. Yeah, odd numbers, you don't need it. In VMware, they deal with this another way, so you don't need a quorum disk.
Okay.
The witness itself, it can be a daemon installed on Debian, for example, or a Windows server.
So you can have it locally.
You could have it locally.
I'm sorry, I thought you meant that you guys were managing it off-site, like away from my.
Oh, like
no.
Oh, and I'm like, well, what happens when the WAN goes away? Because there are issues then.
No,
what I think of when I'm hearing this is, and this is good stuff. It's I'm thinking like a left hand, like a VSA from HP.
Correct.
Right. You know, you can run virtual.
That's where the Twitter storm will be coming from
and
at the
I'm
moment.
sure they're all and you know, you can run the virtual manager and you can spin up. You know, so you don't have a split brain scenario. You know, you can spin up your virtual managers and all that, and it keeps quorum and all that good stuff. So it sounds very similar, but probably totally different, obviously.
So, I mean, just to provide some clarity, so the witness, like you were saying, it can be on site, but it can also run remotely across the WAN link.
Okay.
Now,
right.
You
recommend outside of the site to have your manager.
Well, most of the customers are trying to keep the costs down, so they don't want a third server in here, or they don't want a third piece of hardware in here. They want to keep it simply.
Right.
So that's what most of our customers want. But if they want a third server, that's no problem. If they want to run it on a different server that's not involved in the cluster, that's no problem. If they want to run it on dedicated hardware, or Raspberry Pi or something like that, that's no problem. So it's give the customer the choices.
Right.
But if you've got 1,000 locations, another piece of hardware, another server, it's a lot of money.
But let's say I've got a low latency location, so we can't really communicate too much, but we want to throw 2 boxes in there. But you said witness server works in a 2 out of 3 scenario for split brain, and I only have 2.
So you have 2 servers on site.
So I've got 2 servers on site, and it's in such a remote location that we really can't access it over the WAN, except for occasional, 56K link up.
So, I mean, you do have limitations there, obviously. So you could run the witness on site as well using, I don't know, like a Raspberry Pi or something, if that was the way you wanted to go. That would be a solution there. We also offer to run without the witness, but our best practices dictate you should actually have it.
Because if you have a split brain scenario, you need a witness to account for that.
Otherwise, you need manual intervention.
So technically, you don't need a witness except for when you need a witness.
When you need it.
Technically,
So you're designing a system for single point of failure. When you design a fault-tolerant system, you normally go for single point of failure, right? You've had a failure. You've had your single point because you've lost your WAN link, right? So you're then asking what happens if you get a second failure.
No, the assumption is I never had the WAN link in the first place. I have
if you don't,
we are a remote office that is so slow and so disconnected, but I've got 2 nodes thrown in here because I adopted a 2-node deployment model on all my sites because I don't need 3 nodes for a split brain scenario witness.
So in that situation, you've got 2 choices, right? Your choice is to actually have on-site a quorum device, or your choice is to run without the quorum device using our best practices. And using the best practices, we actually reduce the possibility of there being a split brain to very, very unlikely. You would actually need to suffer multiple link failures to actually get there. So once more, you're talking about multiple failures. But you then need to follow the best practice. And we have a lot of customers, people like, as I say, wind farms and the like, that actually like that model to actually keep the cost down because they don't particularly want 3 servers trying to fit that into the base of a windmill either.
Absolutely.
Right? So if you follow the best practices, then that works fairly well as well.
So, sorry, I just want to clarify that it is important. There isn't any concept of not needing a witness. You definitely need a witness, but your solution has far more options in having a witness, be it remote, be it a Raspberry Pi.
Be shared witness for all the remote sites.
All the remote sites, which is certainly a benefit. But you definitely do need a witness. Your solution is clever because you've got far more options to create that witness. Worst case scenario, you don't have a witness. You only have 2 hosts remotely in a wind farm which has very poor WAN connectivity, but your software is engineered in such a way that it's far more difficult to get a split brain scenario. I mean, is that
I'm going to sit down. You're taking over. That was perfect.
How can you restate that in a tweet?
Storm is going to say, these guys are saying they don't need a witness, but you do, but you've got more options.
We recommend that you run with the witness. You actually said it's spot on. So the vast majority of our customers will run with the witness.
So what happens? You've got all of this there's a lot of resilience in there to stop split brain. What happens if you do get split brain? How do you fail?
We detect that if you actually get the situation where there's a split brain, we detect that there's a split brain and you call for operator intervention. We actually say to the operator, you've got a problem, right? You need to make a choice which side of the data is the data you actually want. And the operator then decides. Because the last thing you want is corruption.
Okay, so again, remote side, I have limited inbound connectivity and I need to make that decision. What is happening to all of my data while I wake up the ops guy and get him to take that intervention?
If you have hit split brain, so what's now happened is you've lost your remote link, you've lost all 3 of your local links, so you've now had 4 failures on site, and you have a situation where you got split brain, then the safest thing is not to operate.
I just want to say you can't hit a split brain if you're using our quorum device because of the logical failures. When you're running without it, there is the possibility if there was, say, network isolation, and that's really the only one where you could encounter split brain, okay? Because if everything is running and you've got network redundancy, UPS underneath and everything like that, the chances of hitting a split brain, minimal. But if somebody came along with a pair of scissors,
and someone decides that they're just going to unplug this because they're not IT people and you've only got 2, you've got thousands of them, and it's not really a cascading failure, it's just because you've got little infrastructure there. You don't have thousands of network servers or anything else, thousands of network devices. Someone just unplugs it.
Yeah.
And so how does my data stay safe so I don't have to completely rebuild the site?
We actually stop allowing you to modify the data at that particular point to protect the
it
data.
will present you with data changes on both sides. So say I've changed X amount on this side and X amount on that side. And from that, you can select which one you want to keep. Now, ideally, what an administrator would do is actually mount both sides. So you can actually break the mirror, mount off your plexes, and actually review the data. Because if you've got, say, virtual machine A on host A and virtual machine B on host B, if they've become isolated and they're both writing, you know which one's actually made the changes, so you can mount them, merge those two VMs together, and delete the other associated one.
What if my VM is straddling both sides?
Yeah.
Well, you would select which one. So if you'd straddle both sides, one of your...
So like the OS is running on one side and my data is on one side, or... So let's take it another step further. Let's say that my Windows VM, I'm building multiple VMDKs together, and I've got VMDKs from one side, multiple VMDKs from here, and I've striped them together for one big data drive. And
if you went into a split brain, because the storage is presented over network because it is iSCSI, if you've actually cut the links in between so they're running independently, those disks, like you were saying, you've got multiple disks, they would appear on both sides. And wherever that VM is residing and whatever application it may be servicing out onto your network, it's only really going to be changed on one side because there'll be confusion if it was being able to access it on both sides. So you would select that one that you've seen that sufficient data change. I mean, you would mount them, and as an admin, you need to check your consistency. But like we said, our preferred best practice, run with a quorum, or take our best practices to never actually enter in that situation.
And keep in mind as well, I mean, what we're actually saying here, you always have identical copies of the data on both sides. Right? So your data here is never different to the data there. You're not striping in that sense, where you actually have the data different. The data is always identical on both sides.
But the concern is not about the identicalness of the data at both sides. It's in the event that we do have a split brain and we're writing data to one side versus the other, who becomes the master copy. And it's not that often that it occurs, but when it does occur,
it could be bad.
That's where people lose their jobs. That's where you know, rubber meets the road and the pain comes in. Thus, you would want to have some type of witness server. And you mentioned Raspberry Pi. Do you support multiple witness servers communicating to the same box? Because at that point, I throw a cluster of Raspberry Pis. I'll spend, you know, $50 and get a bunch of them, and then at least if many or some of them were to fail, I still have that level of availability for a much lower price point. But at least I have the comfort of knowing I'm not going to run into the witness situation, especially having to have a remote box or make a massive investment in order to make that possible.
I would actually suspect you're suggest you're overcomplicating it at that stage.
Yeah, but if I'm talking a remote wind farm that doesn't have any manned operators, there's a little complication is worth it than having someone to drive 6 or 12 hours just to get to that location to fix something.
But if you keep in mind, right, you've lost your WAN link. That's one failure.
Is often you don't have a WAN link.
You've lost 3 internal communications links. That's 3 failures. You got 4 failures. Now, what's happened there? Someone's pulled wires, and I would suggest no matter how many Raspberry Pis you have,
I've seen split brain scenarios where all connectivity was completely operational. So I can't predict for what actually would cause the split brain or the witness to come into effect. I mean, that's in the perfect world, I have lost 3 links. But in a actual witness split brain scenario, something happened and we don't know who the master is. And that's what happens in the real world of deployments of, I don't know what happened, but I need to know the master copy so I can continue serving data. Because the moment I stop serving data, who knows what impact that's going to make to the business.
You should know, because that's what you're designing it for. But so for some of this, I agree. Well, I think we're over.
It can't come for every architecture. You know what I mean?
I think we're overcomplicating stuff. So some of this, it could be, I've got 1,000 sites. I'm not going to have unique software all over the place because that's a management nightmare. So a lot of this would be, you know what? It's hosed. We ship in a new one with a new copy of all of the software and everything else. So and we can do some sort of data recovery if there is specific data that's there that's really important. But yeah, if it's so critical that you cannot possibly have a split brain situation, maybe this isn't the right solution for that particular site anyway, or you can use some of these other options to design around that if you definitely need to pick StorMagic. So we don't need StorMagic to be the perfect solution for all of these use cases.
What typically running? What applications are they delivering to these remote sites? Are they
It would depend.
clients or web?
It would depend on the vertical. So one of the most important verticals to us, which we'll talk a bit about later on, is retail. And there, you could be talking about point of sale, you could talk about inventory, you're talking about people management, whether that's monitoring footfall or whether that's your employees. But they'd be quite typical of the type of applications.
So you would you be competing against, like, in data center computing systems like a Citrix XenApp or RDS? Because I've worked in enterprises where we've got a lot of WAN links and they're retail oriented. And we solved this problem by not deploying a server. We would just stand up a XenApp farm and deliver the remote application over RDP or something. Is that not?
It goes back to, do you have the bandwidth, do you have the latency, do you meet the compliancy requirements of doing everything on a remote link? And in some applications the answer is yes, and in some applications the answer is no. If the answer is yes, then there's no need for our technology there, but there's an awful lot of applications where the answer is no.
Oh, you've just got a question from Twitter about how does asynchronous replication work? Is it multicast based?
Multicast based. So basically, if both sides of the mirror.
Do you mind just repeating the question, because I know my mic isn't working? So.
Oh, okay. So the question came from Twitter if it was multicast based. So to give an overview of the mirroring, the VSAs will both sit on a host, on their own hosts, and they have the internal disks of that host. Okay, so they take ownership of those. We synchronously mirror the data. Basically, if a write comes down from a VM associated on top, let's say it's on a VMFS, which is on the iSCSI device which we're presenting up, the write will come down to its local VSA, and the VSA will actually handle committing that write to the second one before it's actually acknowledged back up to the top. So writes are committed to both sides before they actually go back up, so we ensure that it's consistent, much like a RAID 1 you could imagine. Reads, because they're not impacted by the fact they need to be committed to both sides, you could read from either side.
And a lot of this detail, we're jumping ahead to Luke's presentation as well. So this is typically the types of questions that.
So I'll be finished by the time by the time we get through this.
So maybe we should probably move on, because I actually don't want to get into too much detail here because he'll have nothing to say otherwise. I said I'd give you some figures. So today we've 30,000 licenses that are out there. I already mentioned our largest customer is 2,200 sites that are managed centrally. Overall, we have 15,000 sites where our technology is implemented out there. We're covering 64 countries and 6 continents. Industries, retail is by far our best vertical so far. We're starting to expand very nicely in the energy retail, manufacturing and government. And in fact, another one that's opening up for us now is hospitality. Hotel chains, restaurant chains, where an awful lot of what they're doing is being more and more automated. People don't know how to cook anymore. They just do what the computer tells them to actually do. Those systems fail, they've got problems. And a little bit about the competitive landscape as well. Our competitive landscape, I actually don't like using that word. If we look at distributed enterprises, if we look at Robo, there's an awful lot of locations that are actually out there. According to VMware, there's 11 million remote offices, but they wouldn't include wind farms, battlefield communication systems, process control systems, so it's a much, much larger number than that. Obviously, there's an awful lot of companies that would like a chunk of that market, and from that point of view, that's good. You know, if we were the only ones addressing that market, then there ain't the market there, right? So it is good that there's a lot of people that want to address the robo market. But in what they do and what we do, they're very, very different. So we've tried to categorize here, and I think you get copies of this that you can look in more detail later if you want, on the way that different people do it. So we're a VSA. And there are other people out there with VSA technologies. Or you could do it within the hypervisor kernel. For instance, that's the way VMware do it with their vSAN product. It could be as an application, it could be as a standalone appliance, EvoRail being the key example there you might be familiar with, or it could be as a reference architecture. So there's a lot of different ways of actually addressing it. And the key thing is, what do we do? What makes us stand out from the crowd that is different? Well, we've actually jumped way ahead with your questions earlier and answered a lot of this. The first thing is we focus totally on the remote site of large enterprises and what their needs are. And a word I really like to use there is simple. It must be extremely simple. It must be capable of being managed remotely. They actually don't want a lot of bells and whistles. They want it to do a job. They want it to continue doing that job, and they want it to do that job reliably. They do want the flexibility of being able to expand. They may want to put a third server, a fourth server, a fifth server, but they want to be able to start with a 2-server solution. Minimum footprint. That large customer actually reckoned by moving to a 2-server solution like ours that they saved $1 million a year on power and cooling costs. Purely by moving to a simple 2-server solution. That remote, the NSH capability that we had a lot of discussion on earlier, being able to centralize that and keep the cost of that infrastructure down is very, very important to them as well. And so we are not trying to be all things to all men, right? We're not trying to be a large data center solution. We're not trying to cover every single aspect within the market, because what's important to us is to keep it simple, to keep it easily managed from the center, and to keep the cost down from a customer's point of view. 1,000 sites, you multiply your investment by 1,000 sites, that's a lot of money. And that's what our target market is, to actually keep the costs down for them, the capital expenditure and the operational expenditure as well. And I think, if I remember rightly, that was the last slide.
Yeah. You're all talking about the edge sites, but is there any reason why you wouldn't use this in your main data center? You have StorMagic for your whole company. Your main data center may have 100 VMs, 200 VMs, whatever. Would you only be using it for the edge, or? Absolutely not, right? So typically what we find is that our customers choose us because of the simplicity at the edge. Then they use the technology and say, wow, this is great. Why don't I use it in my distribution centers, where they might have 7 or 8 servers? And say, wow, this is great. Why don't I use it in the data center? But it's not where we focus. It's not where we focus our marketing. And there are some very good data center solutions that are actually out there at the moment that, you know, I don't have the budgets that a lot of these big companies have. So, you know, I'm not targeting the data center where most of the names I showed you earlier are actually targeting. It'd be very difficult for me to say, excuse me, there's us too, right? We're focused on where we know we can do things extremely well and our competitors don't. So yes, you can use it in the data center, but typically we find we're used at the edge and we're used in the middle between it. Distribution centers would be a typical example.
And you don't need a private WAN link. When I'm managing 1,000 remote StorMagics, that can go over 443, or I can encrypt it. I don't need to have MPLS everywhere.
No, I mean, the data between the remote site and the quorum device, there's nothing there apart from a heartbeat. There's nothing. Yeah, there's nothing there that is
management.
The management piece as well. I mean, our plugin in a vCenter environment, VMware environment, it sits within vCenter, so all of your management is being performed straight through all the same connections. Which you'll see something. You'll see that later on in the demo.
Now, do you support the web client as well?
Yeah, that's what I'll actually use today.
To that, does it require vCenter, or could we stand up ESXi instances at each of these remote locations so that way we save on the vCenter license, like vCenter Essentials or something, at each of these locations, so that way I'm not spending an extra $3K just in licensing for a wind farm?
You could implement ESX Essentials or vSphere Essentials, but you wouldn't have HA. It's not part of the feature set in there. So
True.
Yes, you could install VSAs both on there, and you could manage them through the web client by going to the VSAs directly. Mm-hmm. And should you have a failure, you could simply import the VM that way, but you wouldn't have that fluid HA failover, but yeah, you could still implement it.
So the reason I asked specifically around that is I've got centralized management ability to manage all my StorMagics. I've got 1,000 plus locations out there. Mm-hmm. But you have no mechanism to support the underlying hardware because you don't care what the hardware solution is. Therefore, I've got, let's say I consolidated down on Dell, I'd have to end up with the Dell management solution, have to manage all of those devices at those remote locations, which adds on an extra cost. Mm-hmm. And if parts fail, et cetera, I need some type of means to identify, mitigate, and ship out parts replacement for that. I just want to understand that, which is in a traditional storage competitive type context. Correct. They include that as part of their value add of they are the one thing to be all. Albeit we are just the storage, which is great, and you integrate within the hypervisor. But from a management standpoint, you'd have to be managing the hypervisor, you have to be managing storage appliance, and you have to be managing the underlying physical hardware, and that might become a challenge in some type of circumstances.
Well, a lot of our customers, what I find as well is they're all VMware administrators. So they're not storage guys, lots of remote sites, they're all these administrators. So they sit within the client anyway, and having that management piece there just brings it up into their view rather than going off onto other storage, GUIs and things like that to actually manage it. So,
and the management interface is built into the GUI. It'll be either a plug-in in either case.
Which you'll see that later.
Yes, we'll see that shortly.